What's going on, guys? I've got an update for the 53 Gold Top Restore. I actually ended up gluing the headstock back on. I thought this was the most important thing to get right. It's what you're seeing. This is historical, and I really wanted to make sure I got this right. I even tried making the inlay out of the exact scan on my scanner back into my CNC machine, and this was not exactly perfect. It was too thin on the B, it just didn't look right, so I decided to essentially cut out a channel, take apart the stuff that was broken and split on the end here. I had so much filler, I didn't want to use that piece of wood. We built a little jig, glued it in, and then inlaid it and added a little bit of filler. We'll show you through that process now.
So I went on eBay and found some pieces of veneer that were about the same thickness as the original headstock, and I had to square it off here so I could see where I was actually going to put this on the neck. So I need a flat spot that I could sort of base everything off of. We're going to glue that on first to the headstock. We're going to draw it and try and understand where the glue is, make sure I've got the straight line, kind of base it off of everything there. Then we're going to apply just some yellow wood glue, tight bond. I actually used a little bit of tape to tape off the truss rod end there so that it doesn't get any glue on it. Make sure you do that so you don't lock up the nut there at all. So just a little bit of glue, not too much. We'll then clear off a spot on the bench here, get a flat piece of wood to put this on and glue it down. What's nice about my setup is I can then drop some clamps on the back side. I've got a sort of level surface I can work against. I'm using a piece of wood and then clamping down, and I'm getting even pressure. Ideally, I would have liked to have another piece of wood on the back, but this works. Clamp it down, adjust some of the clamps, one a little bit deeper reach, and that's it. So then I get a razor blade and I score the rest of the veneer. That way I don't have to sand it. This becomes very brittle, and sometimes you can rip pieces out. So I'm just scoring this here with a razor blade, getting in all the nooks and crannies. We'll then move this over to the drill press, and we've got a 3/8 drill bit here. We're going to use the same tuners as before. Just go in and pop this through. And I've got a backing board so I don't get any blowout. And then we're going to perform surgery here on the old headstock plate. And I'm cutting along the line of the ruler with a sharp razor blade. And we're going along the tuner holes because I'll have the ability to cover this up with the black paint, and it's much cleaner. I won't have the line. I didn't want to just have one line towards the top. If the wood shrank, you would see it pretty bad. It would look evident or obvious. And then we're just going to sand each side so that it's flat. Got to be really careful with this at this point. It's very thin. The inlay's cracked, so I want to make sure that it doesn't get any worse. But I do have to sand it flat so that the piece sort of melts into the new veneer that's there. So I've got some really low-tack double stick tape here, and we're just going to peel it off, place the veneer on, and then take this over to my drum sander and just adjust it ever so slightly to take off the littlest pass each time. I was really scared as I was doing this because I wanted to make sure that I had no issues and that I only took off the very little bit just to make sure it was flat. So then we bring this back downstairs, take it off the tape, and then build the jig to re-inlay this back on at the top. So the original inlay is cracked in a couple of spots. and I wanted to be really careful not to sort of break it or chip it. But we're going to start with some double stick tape, and we're going to build the jig around this. So that's the approximate spot it's going to go. I've got some oak here, and I'm going to build this magnificent little jig to make sure that this fits perfectly. And so I'll show you how it's done here. We'll get the double stick tape on in the right spot. You can see the J or the N popped out a little bit here. But now I've got it so that it's perfectly on seam, on center. We'll cut that block for the end. Draw that out and cut it. Get another piece of double stick tape. Make sure that that piece fits in. Fits in just slightly. Behind me is a sanding board that I can just sand on really quick. That N is starting to cause a little bit of trouble. Cut this, so I'm using a couple pieces of wood as a support. So I'm going to get some really small clamps and build a little support so that now this won't move anywhere. I'm going to be using my small Colt Bosch router with a top bearing bit. It's a 1/4 inch depth with, I guess it's a 1/2 inch in size. And we're just going to take a couple light passes off the top there to redo the inlay or redo the headstock. So we get this set, and you can see it's a really nice setup actually. Got to make sure I've got the right height to do the routing. So I've got some 2x4s. We'll lay this on. Make sure that it doesn't move. Plug this sucker in. And then this is slightly terrifying, to be quite honest. Because now I've got the neck done. I've got it clamped down. And we're just going to take the smallest veneer pass as possible. And I do this 4 times to get this right. And I can test it as I'm doing it, which is nice. So the first pass takes off just like a scratch. Same thing with the second pass. All I do is put the router down the material and just use the thumb wheel and just take it down a little bit. And be very, very careful. This little jig actually worked out really nice. There's the bit. Make a slight adjustment and take one more pass. And here you can see I've gotten down to the mahogany. And that fits pretty close. That N keeps causing problems. We'll do one more cleanup, make sure that it's all flat. And that looks about right. Take off the little jig with the little clamps and the little pieces of wood. This was supported perfectly. And then I can see the height is perfect. Pop off the rest of the jig with the double stick tape. And that's spot on. You can see the N is off to the side. We got a little bit of super glue and glued in the N. I didn't film that. But once that was in, we let that dry. And we came back and popped in the piece of the puzzle that makes this work. So we're all cleaned up. We'll get a little bit of yellow glue, type on wood glue, spread it out. Definitely not using too much glue here. Make sure it's in. Got some wax paper here so it doesn't stick. Got 1 clamp, 2 clamp, 3 clamps, and we're done. So I've reinforced the headstock where it cracked. I've got the veneer in. Add a bunch of clamps to make sure it's secure. And then we'll come back with some filler and cover in where we have some of the problems. And so at least this goes down to the truss rod cavity, and the truss rod cavity will cover up some of that between the lower tuner holes. So like I said, this I thought was the most important piece that I wanted to get right. I couldn't reuse that inlay. It just wasn't going to happen. So I'm glad that this worked out. I thought about this actually for a long time, and I ran, I'd say 3 or 4 different versions of this on my CNC, and going with the original was the best way. So once that filler is dry, I come back with, I think this is 220 grit, and just sort of sand it away. Spent, I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes doing this. Very, very light, gentle sanding at this point. Don't want any sort of ridges or grooves from sanding. So I'm going very gentle just to sand out where it needs to be cleaned up. It's actually feeling pretty good. And then we got to pop through and pull out the truss rod cavity here. So I've got a whittling knife, and I know where it is approximately, and we'll just slowly cut at this to peel it out. Again, I'm being very careful, very deliberate with this. Too much, and I've got a big mess on my hands because I can't modify this headstock anymore. So going slow, cleaning it up. And then we're getting ready to glue all this together, finish the assembly next, and then we'll get the paint going, do the gold top with the dark back most likely. Sand those edges down with a little bit of file. Again, lots of back and forth, being gentle here. So that's the headstock re-inlaid, cleaned up, all ready to go. Thanks for watching, guys. We will see you in the next video.